I had the chance to see Tenet last week, as part of its 2024 re-release in IMAX 70mm, and I've got to tell you, it's a better film than most people give it credit for. Now, I know it's the most controversial of Nolan's works, by which I mean it gets the most mixed reviews among critics and die-hard Nolan fans. And I'll readily admit, this is by no means Nolan's greatest work, but it's also not just 2.5 hours of confusing nonsense. In a lot of ways, it is actually his most interesting film. The complexity of the film, which so many people resent, actually gives the viewer a lot to explore and unpack. And, approaching this from a philosophical perspective, it is incredibly fascinating. Fundamentally, it boils down to this. Tenet is so hard to understand because it is a demonstration of a paradox, namely the grandfather paradox. Those in the future are attempting to destroy their own ancestors. So, what is the grandfather paradox? Well, as Michael Lockwood explains in The Labyrinth of Time, the grandfather paradox is a paradox of foreknowledge. To put it more simply, the grandfather paradox basically explores this idea. Someone, let's call him John, travels back in time on a mission to kill his own grandfather. But if he succeeds, then how could he have been alive to commit the act? It's an interesting question, and seemingly unsolvable, which is why it's a paradox, but as we examine it more and more, we get a basic idea of what would happen if such a thing were possible. If someone goes back in time to kill his own grandfather, he will not only necessarily fail in this mission, but as he becomes more and more involved in his grandfather's past, he will become, to a greater or lesser degree, more instrumental in bringing about his own birth. Similar to the prophecies found in ancient Greek myth, the passage of time is inevitable, and the logic of prophecy is strikingly similar to that of time travel. In the ancient myths, if you attempt to change a prophecy about your future, you become a necessary piece of the puzzle, as is demonstrated in the story of Oedipus. You can't escape your fate. But what is more fated to happen than what has already happened in the past? Therefore, if you attempt to change the past, you must become an inevitable part of the fabric of past reality. Essentially, the necessity of a time traveler in past events suggests an infinite loop of the same event. And this is the real tragedy of Tenet's story. Throughout the film, Neil constantly reinforces the phrase, "What's happen's happened." And we see evidence for that time and time again as the film progresses. For instance, when the protagonist goes through the turnstile in order to retrieve the missing piece of the algorithm, he ends up creating the necessary circumstances for that piece to fall into Sator's hands. But this also means that in order for the side mirror of that car to have been broken, he must have already gone through the turnstile and traveled back in time. The same issue arises at the end of the film, when Neil has to go through the final battle another time in order to not leave anything to chance. He knowingly goes to his death because he has no choice. He's already sacrificed his life in the future past. How do you escape this fatalism? And so, to circle back to the point I made at the beginning, this whole film is a demonstration of the grandfather paradox. Those in the future, in their arrogance, attempt to completely reverse the flow of time, destroying past reality. In this attempt, they create a series of events which lead to their own defeat. They attack the Kiev Opera House, through which the protagonist comes across that final piece of the algorithm. The protagonist becomes involved in stopping them, and then founds Tenet in the future with the sole mission of ensuring the algorithm is never used. What's happen's happened.